You know, because General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, virtually ended the Civil War, tonight's commemoration marks essentially the close of the Civil War sesquicentennial. And I think for all that's happened in our nation's, since our nation's founding, we should not take for granted just how extraordinary it is that our country stayed together for so long. Before Ulysses S. Grant assumed supreme command of the Union armies, a total of 6 Union commanders in the East had failed to achieve the decisive strategic victory that was necessary to defeat the Confederacy. The last 5 had faced Robert E. Lee, and both suffered devastating defeats at the hands of his armies. When Grant and Lee first faced each other in May of 1864, the terms of battle had changed. Unlike most of his predecessors, Grant would target Confederate armies more than cities. Additionally, instead of armies acting independently of each other in different theaters, Grant coordinated Union armies throughout the Confederacy to a degree never before attempted, which was necessary for victory on the offensive side over a region spanning so much of the continent. The first phase of confrontation between the two great generals was the 43-day Wilderness Campaign, the brutal overland campaign most often remembered for the massive casualties on both sides. But much more than that, it was a dynamic campaign of maneuver that occurred over 100 miles of difficult terrain. Grant seized the initiative within 48 hours of the campaign and never let go. Lee usually held his ground and reacted with visible skill to Grant's maneuvers, but he was largely limited to reacting to Grant, unable to retrieve the strategic initiative for himself. The campaign of maneuver brought the armies to Petersburg, the breadbasket of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. There, during what is known as the Petersburg Campaign, Grant's troops besieged the city for over 9 months, focusing on severing Petersburg's many wagon and rail connections to the south and west, and seeking a decisive break through enemy lines. Grant ordered a major offensive to begin on March 29, 1865, which he hoped would force a decisive engagement with the Confederate Army, and for this, he counted on General Phil Sheridan's 10,000 cavalry, which was returning from victories in the Shenandoah Valley. On the 1st of April, Sheridan defeated a combined Confederate task force commanded by General George Pickett at a major road junction near Petersburg known as Five Forks, which cut off these lines of supply. Grant followed up with an all-out offensive against Confederate lines on April 2nd. 18 hours of continuous fighting would break Confederate defenses southwest of Petersburg. President Jefferson Davis was interrupted at church services that Sunday morning by a messenger carrying a telegram from Lee informing him that he had to evacuate Richmond and Petersburg that very night. Davis fled. Union forces occupied Richmond the very next day, April 3rd. Lee's retreating columns headed west toward a village along the Richmond and Danville Railroad called Amelia Courthouse, expecting to receive rations there, and then to proceed south to join with Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Tennessee, coming from North Carolina. But Grant's troops were in hot pursuit. At Amelia Courthouse, Lee discovered that the rations were not coming, and there was little food to gather from area farmers. Even worse for him, his intended route of retreat south was blocked by Union cavalry. So instead of heading south, he continued to march west in the direction of Lynchburg. His immediate goal was now a town called Farmville, where the Confederate Commissary General promised that Lee would receive 80,000 rations. Desertions from Lee's tired and hungry army were now increasing. The largest battle during the pursuit occurred on April 6th at Sailor's Creek, a few miles east of Farmville. There, Sheridan's cavalry exploited a gap in Lee's lines to cut off 2 Confederate corps until infantry in the 6th Corps secured a victory so decisive that nearly a fifth of the Confederate army was forced to surrender. This included nearly 8,000 men and 8 generals, including Corps Commander Richard Ewell. As he watched survivors of the battle staggering along the road, Lee exclaimed, "My God, has the army dissolved?" The rest of Lee's army reached Farmville on April 7th. Although rations were waiting there as promised, Union troops were pursuing them so quickly that most Confederates had to flee before they could pick them up. Lee continued west, hoping to be supplied elsewhere. He knew that he was being followed by 2 Union infantry corps, but he did not realize that additional troops, which included part of General Edward Ward's Army of the James, were taking shorter roads en route to cutting him off. On the evening of the 7th, Lee received a 2-sentence letter from Grant stating, "The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the CS Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." Lee would not surrender quite yet. In another round of correspondence the next couple of days, Lee disagreed on the hopelessness of further resistance, but proposed meeting Grant at 10 a.m. on the morning of April 9th to discuss how the two of them could work toward what he phrased the restoration of peace. Early on the 9th, Grant declined Lee's proposal, saying, "I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace," but he added that it was clear peace can be had by the South laying down their arms. The day before, April 8th, found Lee's troops halted a mile northeast of a village called Appomattox Courthouse. Their path blocked both south and west by several of Grant's troops under Ward and Sheridan. Lee decided he should try one more time to escape. At dawn on April 9th, General John Brown Gordon's corps attacked the Union cavalry blocking the stage road, only to see, as they advanced into the breach, Ward's men emerging from the woods. These included 2 infantry brigades from the U.S. colored troops whose role in blocking the Confederates would be celebrated for years to come. Gordon knew that he was trapped. He sent word to Lee, "My command has been fought to a frazzle, and unless Longstreet can unite in the movement or prevent these forces from coming upon my rear, I cannot go forward." Lee acknowledged his scattered commands could accomplish little. General Edward Alexander, a close confidant of Lee, suggested that the Confederates take to the woods, in other words, revert to a guerrilla war. But Lee rejected that, saying that it would cause a state of society throughout the South from which it would take years to recover. Besides, he added, "I am too old to go bushwhacking." Lee concluded, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." So Lee sent a 2-sentence letter replying to Grant's last note turning down the 10 a.m. meeting. "I received your note of this morning on the picket line, whither I had come to meet you and ascertain definitely what terms were embraced in your proposal of yesterday with reference to the surrender of this army. I now ask for an interview in accordance with the offer contained in your letter of yesterday for that purpose." The Confederates put up flags of truce, and the letter made its way to Grant. The sight of those flags and rumors of imminent surrender surprised even some high-ranking Union officers in the area. Brigadier General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain exclaimed, "What a word is this! So long, so dearly fought for, so feverishly dreamed, but ever snatched away, held hidden and aloof, now smiting the senses with a dizzy flash. Surrender!" The Civil War claimed the lives of 620,000 Americans, according to traditional estimates, and recent scholarship suggests that that number is actually closer to 750,000. Could this truly be the end? Lee's letter reached Grant nearly 2 hours after Lee had written it. Grant had been suffering a terrible migraine headache that day, but as he later wrote, "The instant I saw the contents of the note, I was cured." Grant quickly replied to arrange a meeting. That letter reached Lee around 1 o'clock as he sat beneath an apple tree that would later become the stuff of legend. Lee proceeded to Appomattox Courthouse for the meeting in the home of Wilmer McLean. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Mr. McLean lived on the battlefield of First Bull Run near Manassas Junction. He disliked the war and wanted to get away from it, so he moved to Appomattox. Lee made his way to the McLean house and waited until Grant arrived at 1:30 to meet him. Now, Lee never wrote about this event, but Grant did. He wrote of Lee, "Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation. But my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on the receipt of his letter, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought." The scene was iconic. Grant entered the McLean house. The two commanders shook hands and took their seats in the parlor. Lee was wearing a new uniform and carrying a ceremonial sword, a gift from an anonymous admirer in Maryland. Grant wore an old uniform with mud-spattered boots and only his 3-star shoulder straps to indicate his rank. Grant later said, "I had no other clothes within reach, as Lee's letter found me away from my base of supplies. I expressed my regret that I was compelled to meet him in so unceremonious a manner." Grant introduced Lee to several of the officers who were with him. Perhaps the most remarkable was the man who would transcribe the surrender terms in ink, Colonel Eli S. Parker. Parker was a full-blooded Seneca Indian from upstate New York and the last Grand Sachem of the Iroquois League of the Five Nations. When they were introduced, Lee stared at him for a moment and then shook his hand, telling him, "I am glad to see one real American here." Parker replied, "We are all Americans." Grant and Lee then fell into conversation about the old days in the Army, about the Mexican War and old friends. As Grant wrote in his memoirs, our conversation grew so pleasant that I almost forgot the object of our meeting. And so they turned to the surrender terms. Lee's troops were paroled, which meant in effect they could return home as long as they didn't take up arms. Officers who owned horses or sidearms could keep them along with their personal baggage. When Lee noticed that the terms as written referred only to officers keeping their horses, he mentioned that in his army, most of the animals in his cavalry and artillery were owned by the private soldiers. In view of that, Grant, who assumed most men in Lee's rank were small farmers with the spring plowing ahead of them, responded that he would give orders allowing any soldier or officer claiming a horse or mule to take it. He later recorded, "General Lee showed some emotion at this, a feeling which I also shared, and said it would have a most happy effect." Before they were done, Lee mentioned that his army was in a very bad condition for want of food. Could he ask for rations and forage? "Certainly," Grant replied. Lee's men would receive rations from Union wagons by Ulysses S. Grant's orders. The interview ended after about an hour and a half, approximately 3 p.m., and as he put his gloves on, about to depart, Lee pounded his right fist into his left 3 times. He looked toward the Confederate line and gave what an observer called a choked sigh. After he mounted his horse, Grant stepped down from the porch and raised his hat to Lee. All the Union officers present did the same. Lee raised his own hat in response and slowly trotted away. As news of the surrender reached the Union lines, the victorious troops began firing salutes. Grant ordered the celebration to stop, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." When Grant returned to his tent, his aide-de-camp, Horace Porter, who would play later on an instrumental role in the construction of Grant's tomb, wrote that we all gathered around him, curious to hear what his first comments would be upon the crowning event of his life. But they were all disappointed. Grant's first words were to his chief quartermaster, Rufus Ingalls. "Ingalls, do you remember that old white mule that so-and-so so-and-so used to ride when we were in the city of Mexico? Grant's modesty was such that his own son Jesse wrote that he had no recollection of ever hearing his father mention Lee's surrender, if you can imagine. "Let us have peace" would be chosen as the epitaph of Grant's tomb because those words that he spoke as a candidate for president summed up the essence of his legacy. When President Lincoln heard the news of the surrender, the scene around the executive mansion, as the White House was then known, was one of unrestrained rejoicing. Lincoln asked the band to play Dixie, noting that the Union had fairly captured the tune. He would be the victim of an assassin's bullet only 5 days after the surrender. Winston Churchill would later write that the magnanimity of the surrender terms stands high in the story of the United States. But much of our nation's memory of the surrender has been clouded by the myth of the lost cause, which downplayed the role of slavery in the secession of the Confederate States and emancipation during the second half of the war. For Grant and like-minded leaders during Reconstruction, Union victory was not only about reconciliation, but also the logical fulfillment of emancipation. Because after Grant's presidency, the nation turned back so many of the civil rights advanced during Reconstruction, few Americans today know that 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, ratified after the Civil War, conferred legal equality upon the former slaves. These long-ignored amendments provided the foundation of the 20th century civil rights movement. The myth of the lost cause also distorts our understanding of the military leadership that brought about Union victory, dismissing the outcome as the inevitable result of the Union's numerical superiority. We know from the last 50 years alone, prominently the Vietnam War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that superiority in numbers alone does not win wars. The Union suffered 3 years of repeated tactical and strategic setbacks in the East under 6 commanders until Grant rose to the top. This point is not academic. The military remains challenged in modern times to employ winning commanders and strategies from the outset of war, as was demonstrated under several leaders in Iraq until General David Petraeus turned around what appeared to be a defeat. We could not have a more fitting guest to mark this anniversary tonight. Insofar as numbers are important, they have been grossly distorted by much of the history of the Appomattox campaign. This is reflected in the plaque at Appomattox that once asserted Lee surrendered 9,000 men to 180,000 men under Grant. In fact, the most reliable estimates indicate that the week-long campaign leading up to the surrender began with nearly 80,000 Union soldiers pursuing 60,000 Confederates and ended with 60,000 Union and 30,000 Confederate troops in the vicinity of Appomattox. The Appomattox campaign succeeded because it was brilliantly executed. Its result was far from preordained. Earlier today, bells rang across the nation, starting in Appomattox at 3 o'clock, the approximate time the surrender meeting was concluded, and then at 3:15 for 4 minutes, representing the 4 years of the Civil War, at schools, historic sites, churches, temples, and public buildings across the land. Tonight, we continue this commemoration of an event that determined the survival of the United States and that made possible the freedom that it promised to those who were denied it. Few events in history possess existential importance to the success of the American experiment, and none surpasses this one in magnitude. Whatever problems we face, Appomattox reminds us that this is not only a great country, but a good country, and that tonight we can celebrate Prince George